After this video, you'll stop pleasing people, not because you've become cruel, but because Carl Jung showed us that people-pleasing isn't kindness at all. Jung discovered that every time you say yes when you mean no, you're not being good, you're betraying yourself, and the people you're desperately trying to please, they don't respect your kindness. They depend on your weakness. Picture this moment. You've just agreed to something you didn't want to do again. Your stomach nods as you smile and nod, while inside you're screaming. You tell yourself you're being helpful, mature, considerate, but Jung would say you're trapped in what I call persona imprisonment. When your mask of agreeableness becomes your cage, Jung spent decades studying why people abandon themselves for others' comfort, but he discovered something that changes everything. The moment you stop pleasing people, you don't become selfish, you become real. And that transformation starts with understanding why you started pleasing in the first place. The answer will shock you because it has nothing to do with being kind and everything to do with childhood survival. But here's what Jung discovered that changes how you see people pleasing forever. It's not a character flaw or a personality trait. It's what I call survival programming, psychological conditioning that begins in childhood when you're authentic. Self gets rejected. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But people pleasers never learned they had that privilege. Instead, they learned that being real meant being rejected, that having needs meant being selfish, that expressing anger meant being bad. So they adapted. They created what Jung called the persona, carefully crafted mask designed to avoid conflict, rejection, and abandonment. They smiled when they wanted to cry. They said yes when they meant no. They became whatever others needed them to be. Jung understood that this persona serves a survival function, but he also discovered its dark cost. When you identify with your mask, you lose contact with your authentic self. You become what I call the hollow helper, someone everyone loves, but no one truly knows. The most devastating part, Jung found that chronic people-pleasing doesn't create the love and connection it promises. It creates the opposite relationships based on utility rather than authenticity, where you're valued for what you do, not who you are. But there's something even more disturbing that Jung uncovered about why people-pleasing becomes so addictive. The addiction cycle. Jung made a shocking discovery. People-pleasing operates like a psychological addiction. You get a temporary high from approval, but it never lasts. Therefore, you need increasingly more validation to feel worthy, creating what I call the approval addiction cycle. Here's how Jung saw this cycle destroying people's authentic selves. First comes the trigger. Someone needs something from you, asks for help, or shows disapproval. Your nervous system activates the old survival program. If I don't please them, they'll reject me. Then comes the fix. You say yes, help out, sacrifice your needs. You get a brief hit of relief, safety, connection. But Jung observed that this relief is temporary because it's based on performance, not authentic relationship. Next comes the crash. You feel resentful, exhausted, invisible. You realize once again that you've abandoned yourself. But instead of examining this pattern, you blame yourself for being too sensitive or selfish, for feeling bad about helping others. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The unconscious pattern driving people-pleasing is the belief that your authentic self is fundamentally unlovable. Therefore, you must earn love through service, compliance, and self-sacrifice. But here's where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. He discovered that this pattern doesn't just hurt you, it actually prevents genuine intimacy. When you relate to others through your persona rather than your authentic self, you create what I call pseudo-intimacy relationships that feel close but lack real knowing. Think about your closest relationships. Do people know your boundaries, your dislikes, your authentic reactions? Or do they know a curated version, always understanding, always available, always agreeable? If it's the latter, Jung would say, you're not in a relationship at all. You're in performance. If you've realized you've been performing a role instead of being yourself, comment, I've been acting, not living. The most tragic part is that people pleasers often attract what Jung called unconscious. Narcissists are individuals who need someone to manage their emotions, carry their responsibilities, and never challenge their behavior. This creates a psychological symbiosis that feels like love, but is actually mutual exploitation. The shadow cost. Jung's most profound insight about people-pleasing involves what he called the shadow. All the parts of yourself you've rejected to maintain your agreeable image. But here's what most people don't realize. When you repress your authentic reactions, they don't disappear. They get stronger underground. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. People pleasers spend enormous energy condemning and suppressing their own needs, boundaries, and authentic responses. But this creates what I call shadow rebellion, when your repressed self starts sabotaging your persona from within. This shows up as passive aggression. You agree to help, but do it grudgingly. You smile while sending subtle signals of resentment. You become what Jung would recognize as split. Your persona says yes, while your shadow says no, creating internal war. It shows up as chronic exhaustion. Jung understood that maintaining a false self requires massive psychological energy. When you're constantly monitoring your reactions, managing others' emotions, and suppressing your authentic responses, you deplete yourself at the cellular level. It shows up as mysterious illnesses. Jung was one of the first psychologists to recognize that psychological repression manifests as physical symptoms. People pleasers often suffer from headaches, digestive issues, autoimmune problems, and chronic pain that have no clear medical cause. Most devastatingly, it shows up as what I call identity erosion. You become so skilled at reading others' needs and adapting to their expectations that you lose touch with your own preferences, desires, and authentic reactions. You become a shapeshifter with no true shape. Jung observed that this splitting creates a dangerous psychological dynamic. The more you suppress your authentic self, the more it seeks expression through unconscious means. You might have explosive anger episodes that surprise everyone, including yourself. You might make sudden impulsive decisions that seem completely out of character. This is your shadow trying to restore psychological balance. But because you don't recognize these eruptions as legitimate parts of yourself, you feel ashamed and double down on people-pleasing behavior, creating an even more destructive cycle. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For people pleasers, making the darkness conscious means acknowledging the anger, resentment, and needs you've been hiding, not to become cruel, but to become whole. The question becomes, how do you integrate your shadow without destroying your relationships or becoming the very thing you've been avoiding? The individuation solution. Jung's solution to chronic people-pleasing wasn't therapy or self-help techniques. It was what he called individuation, the psychological process of becoming who you actually are beneath your conditioned responses. But Jung understood that for people pleasers, this process feels like death because your entire identity has been built around being needed by others. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For people please, self-acceptance means accepting parts of yourself you've been taught are bad. Your anger, your needs, your boundaries, your capacity to disappoint others." This is where Jung's understanding becomes revolutionary. He realized that what people please call selfishness is actually what they call mean is actually honest. What they call difficult is actually authentic. The fear isn't becoming a bad person. It's discovering you were never as bad as you thought. The individuation process for people pleasers involves what I call shadow integration, consciously reclaiming the parts of yourself you've disowned. This doesn't mean becoming aggressive or cruel. It means becoming complete. Step 1 is recognizing your authentic reactions without immediately suppressing them. When someone asks something of you, notice your body's response before your mind jumps to people-pleasing mode. Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." Your heart's first response before conditioning kicks in is usually your authentic truth. Step 2 is learning to sit with others' disapproval without immediately trying to fix it. Jung understood that people pleasers are terrified of negative emotions, both their own and others. Therefore, they become emotional managers, constantly monitoring and adjusting everyone's feelings. But this prevents authentic relationship because it robs others of their right to feel their own emotions. Step 3 involves what Jung called the collision with the unconscious, the moment when your old patterns no longer work and you're forced to find new ways of relating. For people pleasers, this often comes as a crisis, burnout, illness, or a relationship that finally demands authenticity. Comment: if you've hit a wall where people-pleasing stopped working, my old patterns broke down. But Jung saw these crises as opportunities for rebirth. When your persona can no longer maintain itself, space opens for your authentic self to emerge. This process isn't comfortable, but it's necessary for psychological health. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. The pain isn't punishment. It's labor pains. Something real is trying to be born through your crisis, and that something is your authentic self." The key is learning to trust this process rather than immediately reverting to people-pleasing behaviors. When others resist your authenticity, the resistance phase. Jung observed that when people-pleasers begin individuation, they encounter fierce resistance, not just from others, but from their own psychological conditioning. What I call the resistance phase is when your new authenticity threatens the unconscious contracts that have governed your relationships for years. People will say, "You've changed." And they're right, you have changed. You've stopped being who they needed you to be and started being who you actually are. Jung understood that this threatens people who benefited from your self-abandonment. But here's where Jung's insight becomes crucial. Their resistance isn't about you becoming worse. It's about them losing access to your unconscious compliance. Jung wrote, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where the will to power is paramount, love is lacking." The people who resist your authenticity most strongly are often those whose relationships with you were based on power rather than love. They loved your usefulness, not your essence. Your boundaries force them to confront this uncomfortable truth. During this phase, you'll face what I call guilt warfare, intense psychological pressure designed to pull you back into people-pleasing patterns. You'll hear phrases like, "You used to be so understanding, or I don't know what's happened to you, or you're being selfish. Jung would recognize these as projections. When someone calls you selfish for setting boundaries, they're revealing their own inability to respect others' autonomy. When they say you've become cold for expressing your needs, they're showing their discomfort with authentic relationship. The resistance phase tests your commitment to individuation. Will you revert to familiar people-pleasing patterns to restore peace? Or will you hold steady in your authenticity despite others' discomfort? Jung wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. Your tribe family, friends, colleagues, has psychological investment in your people-pleasing patterns. Your authenticity disrupts their unconscious expectations." But Jung also observed that those who weather this resistance phase emerge stronger and more integrated. You develop what I call authentic confidence, peace with being misunderstood, rather than desperation to be liked. This doesn't mean becoming aggressive or dismissive of others' needs. It means responding to others from choice rather than compulsion, from wholeness rather than wound, from strength rather than fear. If you've noticed people treating you differently since you started setting boundaries, comment, "I stopped managing their feelings." Some relationships won't survive your individuation. And Jung would say, this is necessary and healthy. Relationships built on your self-abandonment were never real relationships to begin with. They were psychological arrangements that served others' unconscious needs while depleting your essential self. But something beautiful emerges from this difficult phase. Space for authentic connections based on mutual respect rather than unconscious exploitation. The integration mastery. Jung believed that successful individuation leads to what he called the union of opposites, the integration of seemingly contradictory aspects of yourself. For recovered people pleasers, this means becoming both kind and boundaried, both caring and self-protective, both generous and discerning. This integration creates what I call conscious compassion, the ability to care for others without abandoning yourself. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another." There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. You learn to offer what serves both you and others, rather than automatically sacrificing yourself. The integrated person develops what Jung called an ethical relationship to the unconscious. You become aware of your people-pleasing triggers and can choose conscious responses rather than falling into automatic patterns. When someone asks something of you, you pause and check in with your authentic self before responding. This pause is revolutionary for people pleasers. In that space between trigger and response, you access choice. You can consider, does this request align with my values? Do I have the energy to fulfill this authentically? Am I being asked because of my competence or my compliance? Jung understood that this consciousness doesn't make you cruel or selfish. It makes you real. You begin helping others from overflow rather than depletion, from genuine desire rather than unconscious compulsion. Your relationships become healthier because they're based on authentic exchange rather than one-sided giving. The mastery phase involves what I call boundary artistry, the ability to set limits with grace rather than aggression. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. When someone's request irritates you, instead of immediately saying yes, you explore what this reaction reveals about your authentic needs. You learn to say, 'I need to think about that,' instead of reflexively agreeing. You practice, 'No, but I can offer this instead.' Rather than total self-abandonment or complete rejection, you develop the ability to disappoint people without feeling like you've committed a crime. Most importantly, You learn to tolerate others' emotional responses to your boundaries without immediately trying to fix them. Jung understood that emotional management is a form of control disguised as care. When you allow others to have their feelings without taking responsibility for them, you offer them the gift of emotional autonomy. This creates space for genuine intimacy because people can show up authentically rather than performing for your emotional management. They learn to process their own reactions, develop their own coping strategies, and relate to you as an equal rather than a service provider. The integrated former people pleaser becomes what Jung envisioned, someone who can engage in authentic relationship while maintaining their essential self. You will love others without losing yourself. You care without becoming depleted. You help without enabling dependency. This is the opposite of selfishness. It's what Jung called enlightened self-responsibility. You take responsibility for your own needs, emotions, and authenticity, which frees others to do the same. The new relationship pattern. Jung observed that when someone completes the individuation process, their relationship patterns transform completely. What I call the attraction shift occurs. You stop attracting people who need managing and start attracting people who appreciate authenticity. This happens because your energy signature changes. Instead of radiating, "I can fix you," or "I'll carry your emotions," you radiate, "I'm available for mutual, authentic connection." Jung understood that we attract what matches our psychological development level. The people drawn to your new authenticity have done their own psychological work. They don't need you to manage their emotions, carry their responsibilities, or sacrifice yourself for their comfort. They're attracted to your realness rather than your utility. But Jung also warned about what I call transition loneliness, period between losing relationships based on people-pleasing and attracting relationships based on authenticity. This phase can feel isolating because you're no longer willing to settle for pseudo-intimacy. But genuine connections take time to develop. Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." But the integrated person experiences a different kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being unknown, but the temporary loneliness of waiting for others who can appreciate being known. This waiting period is actually healing. You learn to enjoy your own company without needing constant validation from others. You develop what Jung called relationship with the self, an internal sense of wholeness that doesn't depend on external approval. When authentic connections do emerge, they feel completely different from your old relationships. There's mutual respect for boundaries, emotional honesty without drama, the ability to disagree without anyone becoming a villain, support that flows both ways rather than in one direction only. Jung believed these relationships represent human potential connections based on conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion, on mutual growth rather than mutual exploitation, on love rather than need. If you've experienced this shift from being needed to being chosen, comment "Real love chose me when I stopped performing for it." The most beautiful aspect of this transformation is that you become capable of the very thing you were seeking. Through people-pleasing, authentic love. But now you receive it because of who you are, rather than despite who you are. Your authentic self, including your boundaries, your needs, your sometimes difficult truths, becomes lovable because you've learned to love it yourself. Jung understood that self-love isn't narcissism. It's the foundation for all authentic relationship. You can finally offer others what you always wanted to offer. Genuine care arising from wholeness rather than compulsive. Helping arising from woundedness. The ripple effect. Jung believed that individual transformation creates collective transformation. When you stop people-pleasing and embrace authenticity, you don't just change your own life. You give others permission to do the same. What I call the authenticity ripple spreads outward from your transformed relationships. People in your life witness someone saying no with grace, setting boundaries without aggression, and caring without self-sacrifice. This challenges their unconscious assumptions about how relationships should work. Some will resist this challenge, but others will be inspired by your example. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Your authenticity catalyzes transformation in others, not through preaching or advice, but through embodied example. Children especially benefit from witnessing authentic adults. Instead of learning that love requires self-abandonment, they see that healthy relationships involve mutual respect and honest communication. You break generational patterns of people-pleasing that may have operated in your family for decades. Your workplace culture shifts when you stop automatically saying yes to unreasonable requests. Others notice that boundaries can be professional rather than personal, that self-respect doesn't require aggression, that caring for yourself enables better service to others. Even casual interactions transform. You stop enabling others' irresponsibility by always accommodating their needs. This forces them to develop their own capability rather than depending on your endless flexibility. Jung understood that society is transformed one individual at a time. Each person who chooses authenticity over approval creates space for others to make the same choice. Your recovery from people-pleasing becomes a gift to the collective unconscious. But Jung also warned that this responsibility can become another form of people-pleasing if you're not careful. The goal isn't to transform others, it's to maintain your own authenticity regardless of others' responses. The ripple effect happens naturally when you live from your integrated self. The most profound ripple is what I call permission granting. Your authenticity gives others unconscious permission to be real as well. In a world full of masks and performances, your willingness to be genuine becomes revolutionary. You model that it's possible to care about others without abandoning yourself, to be kind without being weak, to have boundaries without being cruel. This is Jung's vision of individuated humanity, conscious beings in authentic relationship, the conscious choice. Jung understood that recovering from people-pleasing isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing practice of conscious choice. Every day presents opportunities to either revert to old patterns or maintain your authenticity. What I call the daily practice of authenticity becomes your path forward. This practice involves micro-choices that seem small but create massive transformation over time. Pausing before automatically saying yes. Checking in with your body's response to requests. Expressing preferences instead of defaulting to whatever you want. These tiny acts of self-respect accumulate into profound change. Jung wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." Your authenticity becomes real through consistent action, not through one-time decisions. Each time you choose honesty over people-pleasing, you strengthen your capacity for authentic relationship. The practice also involves what I call compassionate firmness, holding boundaries with love rather than aggression. You learn to say no in ways that honor both your needs and others' dignity. This isn't about becoming hard or uncaring, but about becoming clear and honest. Jung believed this consciousness represents evolution, the development of human beings, who can love without losing themselves, care without depleting themselves, and connect without abandoning themselves. It's not selfish, it's integrated. The ongoing challenge is maintaining this consciousness during stressful periods, when old patterns feel safer, when someone's upset with your boundaries, when conflict feels too difficult, when approval seems easier than authenticity. These are the moments that test your commitment to individuation. But Jung observed that each time you choose authenticity over approval, you become stronger and more integrated. The pathway that once felt terrifying becomes familiar. The responses that once seemed impossible become natural. You develop what Jung called psychological backbone inner structure that supports authentic relating. This doesn't mean becoming inflexible or unable to compromise. It means compromising from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than fear, from wholeness rather than wound. You can negotiate and collaborate while maintaining your essential self. Comment if you've learned to hold your ground while staying open to others. I bend without breaking. Jung's vision for the individuated person includes the capacity for what he called creative adaptation, responding authentically to life's demands without losing contact with your core self. This is mastery-level consciousness, fluid yet grounded, responsive yet boundaried, caring yet self-protective. The daily practice becomes less effortful as it becomes more integrated, but it never becomes unconscious. Consciousness requires ongoing attention, but this attention becomes joy rather than burden. After this video, you'll stop pleasing people, but not because you've learned techniques or strategies. You'll stop because you finally understand what Jung knew. People-pleasing isn't kindness. It's self-betrayal disguised as virtue. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That privilege was always available to you, but you traded it for the illusion of safety, the promise of love, the hope of acceptance. Now you understand that real love, the kind worth having, can only come to your authentic self. The people you lose when you stop pleasing weren't loving you anyway. They were using the performance version you created to avoid rejection. When that performance ends, space opens for people who can appreciate the real you. Boundaries, needs, authentic reactions, and all. This isn't easy work. Jung understood that consciousness comes with a price. You'll face resistance, guilt, and the discomfort of learning to be yourself in a world that preferred your mask. But the alternative, continuing to betray yourself for others, comfort, is no longer acceptable. You weren't born to manage others' emotions. You weren't designed to carry responsibilities that aren't yours. You weren't created to be liked at the expense of being real. Jung saw through this illusion and offered a different path, the path of becoming whole. Every time you choose authenticity over approval, you honor the deepest part of yourself. Every boundary you set with love creates space for genuine connection. Every no you speak from your truth opens the door for meaningful yes. This is your individuation journey. Not perfect, not complete, but conscious. You're learning to love others without losing yourself, to care without depleting yourself, to be kind without being weak. If you want to explore more, you're learning to love others without losing yourself, to care without depleting yourself, to be kind without being weak. If you want to explore more about developing the self-awareness to read others while maintaining your authenticity, check out my video on how to see someone's true character. Pay attention to just two things as we dive deeper into Jung's insights about psychological discernment. Your people-pleasing days are over. Your authentic life begins now.